page, here's our agenda for today. You can see that we're going to be talking in the first 5 minutes about what are the best practice data center options. What are people looking at short and long-term strategy? Then we're going to talk about the data center elements. What comes into, what's considered when developing these data center strategy. Part 3 is we're going to talk about cloud versus colocation versus enterprise versus edge, application candidacy. Who does it? What does that mean? Cybersecurity and hybrid. We're going to be talking about vendor neutrality of a data center strategic plan, total cost of ownership versus best practice. Then we're going to be talking about the latest trends. What does that mean? Cloud, co-location, and the like. And ultimately, we're going to have questions and answers. And by the way, the questions will be limited to those that we want to take the question from. So some of you folks from England or from Vancouver or from Canada, or even you folks in the United States, we're going to limit them because we know who you are. I'm only kidding. Let's go on to part 1. What are the best practice data center options for my short and long-term strategy? And again, what you can see is, depending on the data center enterprise, a hybrid solution. We're seeing this more and more. It's a combination of cloud, public, private. It's a combination of co-location. It's a combination of enterprise, and it's a combination of edge. We are finding, though, one size does not fit all. We are finding that depending on the customer, depending on the type of data, depending on what they're trying to process. But the point is, we are seeing many, many customers go to a hybrid solution. The best practice drivers in developing a data center enterprise solution. The bottom line is people want to understand total cost of ownership versus risk versus best practice. And you can see data liability, compliance, cybersecurity. The next page talks about disaster recovery and maximize OpEx, minimize CapEx. But the point is, this is getting into a very interesting point of our society in data center hybrid solution is, what is the total cost of ownership versus risk versus best practice? That's a very, very interesting discussion and process. We are finding that people are struggling sometimes to put together all those costs and risks and identify them. Ultimately, what we're trying to do for the board of directors or the trustees or the taxpayers is provide a best practice vendor neutral type of solution as to how does this all come together? What would I do if I was a stockholder type of scenario? And not to bias any sort of opinion from that, because not being in any of those, well, the cloud marketplace and so on and like, but we have all the costs associated with it. The data center enterprise hybrid solution across those 4 components is modular, scalable, flexible, reliable. That's absolutely key. Whether you're in the cloud or whether you're in co-location or enterprise or edge, how does this scale on demand with the flexibility and reliability? And how do I contain my costs as I'm going through all that? The key is on number 4, what goes where, for how long? This is absolutely the industry today. People are struggling with it. Does it all go to cloud? Does it all go to co-location? Does it stay in enterprise? Does it go to edge? What should I do? Where should I go? How do I protect my stockholders? Some applications, what we're finding in number 5, are not conducive to the cloud today. And that's a very interesting scenario that's going on right now. Be it the software complexity or the hardware platform configuration or the compliance or regulatory issues, they're not necessarily conducive to the cloud. We've had some customers actually identify these, and that's part of where the enterprise is driving. So the key is, if I'm a stockholder, I want to maximize my return on investment. I want to minimize my risk. I want to do what's a state-of-the-art, scalable, modular solution going forward. Let's go on to part 2. What are the data center elements? So considered when developing a comprehensive data center strategy. Now, BRUNS-PAK, as many of you folks are familiar with, been around for 39 years. And I'm only 27 years old, Brian Rawson, so figure that out. Anyhow, I had to throw that in. The point is this. The data center enterprise solution and all the elements of total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk has really come full circle now. This is becoming very, very key to understand, well, what should I consider when I talk about total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk? Let's go to the next slide. This is our opinion, if you would. This is based on our experience in meeting with various boards, trustees, tax-paying type of people, is these elements all combine, in our opinion, as to how do I determine what data goes where, for how long, in the life. As you can see, we call it the hybrid 2019 transformation enterprise data center elements. Take a look at it. Number one is, hey, here's my enterprise. What do I do with it? Is it applicable? Is it not? How does energy efficiency play with me? This is actually really key, because ASHRAE 9.9, taking advantage of the outside ambient temperatures, and young Kevin out there in Winnipeg, certainly they're in an igloo for about, about 11 months out of the year, then the mosquitoes come. I had to throw that in, Kevin. But anyhow, the bottom line is that, hey, out taking advantage of outside ambient temperatures, why not? 80-degree inlet temperature, sure. Delta T at 20, 25 degrees, sure. Why would I pay for that when I don't have to pay for it? The next consideration is my hardware. What platforms am I deploying? And we're going to talk about that in a bit. The iCloud, recent announcement of the server from IBM at 22 kW for a server. That's pretty robust. Cloud, how does that play with me? Internal, external. 5, disaster recovery. Am I going to be replicating my tier 1 applications or not? Or do I replicate anything? Or do I have a restoration time of 24 hours? Colocation. How does that play with me? What's the difference between colocation and cloud managed services? Migration, relocation is a consideration. Whenever you move, it's the cost. It's the migration, relocation cost. In addition to many times seed equipment. Applications, what am I running? How critical are they? Where are they going to be located? Modularity, scalability, reliability is absolutely critical to all this. This all blends into total cost of ownership. Just think about this. Total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. Communications network, what's that look like? Am I transporting data back and forth to a remote site? What's that cost per month? Service level agreements, do you have them? Personnel. I think the mission of the world is to get rid of all personnel. I'm only kidding. But the point is, do I go contract versus hire? CapEx versus OpEx. It's very interesting because I want to minimize my capital expenditures, maximize my OpEx. But we're going to talk about that in a second. Modular data centers, how does that play into my role? Short-term, long-term? Government, corporate, university, nonprofit issues that I have to think about. 16, dominating, the legal repercussions. The legal beagles are in this now. My data gets, and again, I never got out of law school, I'm proud to say that. If my data gets permanently borrowed from a third-party site, who's liable for that? Who's paying? Cybersecurity issues, we're dealing with that every day on everything that we deal with. Compliance issues now that are really coming in with regulatory concerns. And then finally, edge computing. So when you take a look at these 19 elements, if you would, in essence, they go into a technology blender to create total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. And ultimately, you can deliver a report to your board, to your managing committee, that by going through this process will identify various candidates of cloud, internal, external, colocation, enterprise, and or edge. Sometimes it's not complete hybrid, sometimes it is. Let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about the critical elements to be addressed at the board trustee level, this comes back all the time in discussing with folks. They want best practices. They want vendor neutrality. This is very key to them. They want to understand, if I was a stockholder, what would I do? What are the latest trends? Because once you establish a strategic direction, it impacts a lot as you can be well aware, when you talk about those 19 elements, a lot of folks. But by the way, this has to be a modular, scalable, flexible solution, in our opinion, that I could always change on the dime. Total cost of ownership, OPEX, CAPEX, funding, short, long term. If I'm a board member, I want to understand the cash flows. What's it look like? But year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. That includes renewals. That includes increased costs at a third-party site when I change the software configuration or my network, or I add some hardware or additional space. I want the modularity, scalability, because, by the way, my business might change. I might have more and more less critical information that I could spin to the cloud right off the bat. I want to be able to take advantage of that. I want to minimize my risk. This is key. The schedule of delivery. When can I have this and how can I deliver it? The cybersecurity focus is dominating many of the conversations that we have with board people. What does it look like? They want to understand the trends and they want to understand uptime. What does it mean to my uptime? The 2019 Continue to Evolve focus, cybersecurity, network, compliance, regulatory issues, damages, edge. By the way, damages are coming more and more in play. If you're holding the data, and you saw Great Britain's Act about data security, you saw in 2019, instituted June of 2019, you saw California pass an act of data security last year. Kind of interesting, because damages, and they're now saying, hey, by the way, if my data is permanently borrowed, somebody's going to be responsible for that. The edge computing is rolling. If you haven't seen it, it's becoming more and more prevalent. Legal impacts of all this are really starting to play at various levels of reliability. Let's go into part 3. Let's talk about cloud versus co-location versus enterprise, application candidacy, cybersecurity, and hybrid. So the cloud, there's a lot of people with a lot of scenarios associated with the cloud. It is moving. There's no question. Managed services. Hey, I don't want to manage myself. I don't want the personnel. I don't want the hardware. I don't want the software. I don't want the network. I want to basically offload that. It's real and it's growing. Internal versus external cloud. Do I need to have an internal cloud versus external? How do I migrate to it? That's the key thing. How long does it take? Migration back, by the way, this is a consideration when you're doing that. As with anything, once you migrate out, think about the repercussions of potentially coming back maybe down the line. We are seeing some moves from the cloud to some edge computing solutions recently. Moves, adds, and changes in the cloud. How are they addressed financially? Troubleshooting, what are my parameters associated with it? And true partner of equal financial stability. We've seen this recently. Some of the gigantic guys, needless to say, are more sound than our federal government, if you would, because they're not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And that's key where you're putting your data. Downtime, who pays? This is evolving in 2019. The days of a half a month's free rent and a couple bubble gums and lollipops and it's okay. People are getting more and more. I just saw recently in a couple contracts where they instituted the damages clause. Security breach, who pays? If the data goes, and it's kind of interesting when you see the news about what's going on, is that you've seen some of the cybersecurity hacks and the like. The terms and conditions are really changing in some of these contracts because, again, of the data, the level of data, the financial impacts if that goes away, and production versus test and development. Test and development is certainly something that go to the cloud tomorrow. And again, there's great candidates for the cloud. If I'm running a popcorn machine, as I said, as a business, I'm going to the cloud. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm not going any further. I'm just going to the cloud. And when we talk about item L, the next page, where you talk about applications conducive to the cloud. So we have a process that we go through talking about tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. Tier 4 being test and development, tier 1 being the critical applications. What does that mean? How does that? That's how we go through a candidacy process talking about what are candidates for cloud, co-location, enterprise, or edge? Where's my data? Who manages it, and do you care? That's another scenario. Ultimately, that's a critical component of your business. New 2019 United States legislation, company liability for data. This is kind of an interesting trend. And again, it's not being well received from a variety of different lobbyists, if you would, because ultimately this liability issue of holding data is something that is picking up momentum in the United States slower than Great Britain or California. I had to throw that in, you California folks. Speed to delivery of applications is key. I don't want to wait 6 months or a year. I want to definitely get that. And that's great when you have managed services that have excess servers and the like that's ready to go. The 2019 contract language for cloud contracts, cybersecurity, damages, really critical, really coming into play. Critical versus non-critical data. Hey, if I have non-critical data and I run into an interruption, what difference does it make? Moves, adds, and changes, how am I doing it? And obviously you've got the big guys, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. If interruption, what's the impact? That's the question, but they are certainly growing in that space. Let's talk about colocation, number 2. The leased data center, this is a leased data center constructed space. Makes a lot of sense for a lot of different types of processing. CapEx schedule of delivery minimized. Hey, I'm not shelling out any dollars. I'm going to pay an OpEx cost when I occupy. The return on investment in general, and let's not get wrapped around the axles here, roughly 3 to 4 years. If you're over 4 years, then the return on investment might suggest that you do your own. Other tenants are a consideration. Would you want to be a tenant next to me? I'm only kidding. You guys out in England. England, by the way, is attached to us. Security breach. Well, downtime. Who pays? Security breach. Again, the same sort of common denominators. People are getting more and more into this. Terms and conditions about the space, about renewals, about the costs, about the energy costs, the densities going from 2-3 kW per cabinet, going even higher. And some of you Columbia folks, we couldn't get into your school, know exactly what that means. Because when you go into the higher densities, obviously that's a cost. The new United States legislation, class action lawsuits and settlements now coming about. When you see these security breaches, by the way, that's before it's law. So there's people voluntarily settling class action lawsuits on data breaches before it becomes law that they can actually be sued. The financial strength of service providers, and we have some of the folks, the colo folks here online with the cloud folks. Yeah, you absolutely, you see a consolidation somewhat of some of the players coming together. Moves, adds, and changes, controlling that cost. And new 2019 internal self-funded colocation leased data center solutions. What's this mean? If you have an enterprise part component that was capitalized at, say, I'm just using a number, 10 million US dollars, there are funds now, there's people, there's investment firms that will turn that into an OpEx cost. So the days where your internal enterprise could only be a CapEx cost, there are people that will actually turn that into an OpEx cost, and it's absolutely happening today. Enterprise drivers, what are they? Compliance, regulatory issues are driving some of this back into the enterprise or keeping it in the enterprise. The hardware configuration, some of these complex hardware configuration and software certainly lend itself to be there. Total cost of ownership is better than outside. This is key. When you do a total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk, think about those 19 elements going back. This is very, very important to do a vendor neutral analysis. And many times, all the costs are not included in any one of these solutions. So the point is, when you do that, it becomes really black and white, whether you're cost effective in an enterprise or you're cost effective in co-location or cloud or with the edge. It's very interesting when you do this analysis. The risk consideration is a driver staying back. The brand exposure. I was speaking to a client, senior person in this a large corporation, He said their number one concern every day is the brand exposure. And as you see, when it comes on ABC News at night, you don't want to be there. That has tremendous impacts. Disaster recovery is another element. If I do run into issue, how am I recovering? Cybersecurity, and ultimately liability. What I'm finding more and more in some discussions, when I buy stock, and as you know, I don't buy stock, but when I buy stock in a company, I'm really buying their board of directors and their superior knowledge in running institutions. If I'm exposed and I don't have a recovery for it, could impact my operations, as you've seen. Some of these hacks and or disruptions have caused multiple hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of stock movement on publicly traded companies. Let's talk about edge computing. Edge computing is a distributed information technology architecture in which a client data is processed at the periphery of the network, as close to the originated source as possible. This is key. We've worked with some of the manufacturing companies in Texas and the like, and again, we're spanning from Texas to California to Florida today to England to Canada. It's kind of interesting. But some of the big manufacturers, auto manufacturers, again, this is public, this is not going non-disclosure. The point is, they want their data right there. They want it from a reliability standpoint. They want it from a transmission standpoint. They want it from an uptime standpoint. And we're seeing more and more of this rolling out. We're also seeing that, hey, by the way, there are some migration from the cloud to edge computing because people they're understanding their total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk, and they're migrating. As you can see, the benefits of edge computing improves the time to action and reduces response time in milliseconds. By the way, it's kind of interesting, and think about the cost metric. Issues, security, licensing, and configuration. Let's talk about applications. So applications, it depends on production versus non-production software, in essence. The bottom line is it's a single point of failure consideration. Examples, think about your data, tier 1 to 4. If there's an impact, what does that mean? So again, getting back to that candidacy, as you can see, banking, stock trading, people who have data. I remember seeing, on the 60 Minutes about where people were mining the data of a trading company before the results hit the trading floor. Kind of interesting. Data analytics with applications are critical. There's my applications, tier 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's go to cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is dominating. It's incredible. There's the 5 different types of attacks that are evolving. What's amazing, and you read this in the news, where you go and get a local town that's held hostage to pay X million. I was reading about, or I was at a conference about Atlanta, got held hostage and they decided to hold out. I believe it was they decided to hold out. They weren't going to pay the coin, the Bitcoin type of ransom. But it took them months of impact. Whereas people are making a business decision to say, hey, you know what? Pay it. But these issues are not necessarily going away. They're actually picking up speed, if you would. Let's go to part 4, vendor neutrality and data center strategic plan, total cost of ownership versus best practice. The key is to be independent when you're making when you're going through this analysis. What is it? Just lay the facts on the table. When you do total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk, it's amazing as to what you come across and what you see. So you have the Gartner group out there, Forrester, IDC. These are some very renowned groups that basically try to be, in my impression, a technical referee and a non-objective or an objective person giving you what they're seeing as the trends in the industry, best practices and the like. They're outstanding resources. Total cost of ownership encompasses OPEX and CAPEX, but when you go back to those 19 elements, think about that for a second. The migration relocation component, the continuous network connectivity cost, the disaster recovery cost, the cybersecurity impact, the compliance regulatory issues, your software applications. Is there any seed equipment that you have to duplicate? Think about that technology spoked wheel of putting together the enterprise total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. As I was indicating, the trends are showing more and more people are taking a potential CapEx cost and they'll fund it to you for 30 years, based on your credit rating, and basically turn that to an OpEx cost. We are also seeing companies deliver, and we have some of our folks on the line right now, that will actually go and consult, design, build, deploy, manage your solution for X dollars a month. And that's a trend that we're seeing. Best practices, again, we talked about the 19 elements. There's that hybrid comes back. Is it part enterprise, part co-location, part cloud, part disaster recovery? By the way, that's not one size fits all. It goes through that technology process with risk, network security, cybersecurity, and compliance. Risk, big thing. I don't care what enterprise you're running. What's the potential brand impact? What's the financial impact? What's the stock value impact? And what's it uptime? I have to say that this is critical on almost all people that we're dealing with. Whether it's universities, whether it's financial institutions, whether it's healthcare, whether it's automotive, right across the line, whether it's massive distribution, healthcare companies, it's incredible. That's what they're really keyed into. Co-location, cloud, expansion costs. You want to make sure we're seeing that, hey, what are they up front? Renewal costs, what are they? Moves, adds, and changes. Defining all this when you have a contract. We have done some RFPs for the cloud community to respond that addresses the customer's initial needs, plus moves, adds, and changes, plus renewal, plus expansion, plus all the elements such that they're putting everybody on a level playing field, which is outstanding. Same thing with co-location, the same scenario, putting together that RFP, making sure that they have everything addressed when they go in there, which is space, compliance, and liability. Let's talk about part 5. We're doing good with time. Let's talk about the latest trends of what we're seeing, co-location, enterprise. Dominating in our view of the data center world is the hybrid deployment. It is all over. And there's various different ways people are going about that. We're finding people want to leverage and they really want to understand what's the best value for them, their company, their stockholders, their trustees, their taxpayers, as to how do I combine this? How do I leverage this? Co-location, cloud, enterprise, edge, while protecting myself and protecting my assets. This is really key. We are finding that more and more trends are people saying, hey, we're working on engagement right now. And we can't talk about it even though they're online. Hey, I have 12 data centers. How many should I have? Where should they be located? What should I do with them? What's the impact of the network? Hey, by the way, I have delivery protocols that I have to get to my customers with, not only today, but in the future. What's the impact for the high performance compute that's coming out? How am I going to manage that? How am I going to manage uptime? How am I going to replicate my tier 1 applications with synchronous data? Because I'm really critical about that. How am I going to meet all my compliance and regulatory issues in the short and long term? Absolutely fascinating. Fascinating process to go through. Managed services, another trend. Growing sector from co-location where feasible. So what we're seeing more and more, if people can go to managed services with some of their data and it's cost effective and the risk isn't there, why not? I definitely want to have that on the radar screen. You can see some of the big folks really growing into that. And some of the co-location space where it used to be just rent space really is going towards the managed service. That's a trend that we're seeing. More clients we're seeing wanting a complete vendor neutral total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk data center enterprise strategic report. They want a true understanding before they initiate. It's interesting, we've become engaged with a couple customers after some of the decisions were made, which were they wanted, once they understood how to go about that, they wanted to understand and come back and double check what they had done. Sometimes that doesn't bear well because maybe 1 in a million, the true total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk, the way we, BRUNS-PAK sees it, necessarily wasn't addressed. And this is paid for itself times pi r squared as you go down the line. Pi r squared. See the engineer? All right, I got you, Brian. OpEx transformations of even enterprise CapEx costs. We're seeing this more and more. People are saying, hey, I always wanted an OpEx solution, but I was always hesitant. I don't care what the CapEx was, capital dollar expenditures. I wanted to go with this. I wanted to understand that now people are actually funding it. And some very, very large financial institutions with some very aggressive rates are transforming OpEx into CapEx. In essence, you have your own operating expense costs per week, per month, per what have you, in addition to some of the massive utility companies that we've worked with that are into this. Let's go to number 5. Another trend that we're seeing, renewal of third-party cloud co-location contracts being shop discounted. This I found is fascinating now. Since the 2008 evolution and some of the renewals, we're actually assisting some of the customers a couple years in advance, by the way, and that's what it really takes, in putting together RFPs and for basically going around from different third-party providers, whether they go to co-location, whether they go to cloud, again, updating their total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk report. But if they have, where they know that they're going to be staying there, we've actually assisted them in being able to put together an RFP for various people to respond to. Some of the cost impacts have been interesting, to say the least, because they've driven the cost down of a so-called same sort of installation significantly, in some cases 40, 50%, which is amazing, absolutely amazing. Number 6 is edge compute. We're seeing gaining momentum, causing shift of location of workloads. Edges are picking up more and more and more speed. We're just getting on the initial application of the 5 evolution and what that's going to mean and where the location of data is going to have to be provided, being close, obviously edge to the end user. High performance compute density is increasing. And even you folks in Miami, right? The point is that some of these research scientists in the universities, it's incredible the amount of data that they're crunching. And we've done universities with hospitals tied to them, where they have patient care applications and all the medical community. The amount of data and the high performance compute is significant. What's interesting in some of the non-critical data of high performance compute, the fact is they don't necessarily need all UPS generator backup because of they're protecting their front ends, but not necessarily everything else within the data center itself. Number 8, and as I indicated, again, IBM announcing their iCloud server at 22 kW. That's fascinating. That's in Iraq. By the way, take a look at that. How would you handle that? What does that mean? Number 8, data security, liability, picking up momentum. GBDR, Great Britain. Hello, Sally, over there. I know you're not British, but we won't go into that. The June 31, 2019, it's impacting, by the way, not only all of Europe, but it also impacts the people that are European citizens that have data here in the United States, because it cascades over here. If the data is impacted, they have the right financially and legally for recourse. Very fascinating. California, 2019. Again, they took the initiative about data security. They're saying, hey, wait a second. If my data is hacked, what does that mean to me? How does that, why am I liable for that? Why did I take a penalty? And the bottom line is, what's that going to mean for our futures of where the data is? And is that going to potentially cause some shift of where data is located? Additional costs without a return on investment? That's something that has to be considered. Modularity, scalability, flexibility, reliability on demand. I'm cheap, as most of you folks know. The bottom line is, I don't want to pay for anything until I'm ready to go. I want to be able to spin this up and pay as I go. That's why the managed service has a great model with that. I'll pay as I go type of thing. It's absolutely awesome. Number 10, third-party liability, contract languages of liability damages. Very interesting. Seeing some of this now introduced into third-party contracts. Had not seen that in previous years, starting to see it more and more. And by the way, that's a cost impact. What does that mean? How are people addressing that? What does that mean to the cost of leasing space? When you start talking about introducing a damage cause of $50 million, and again, I'm not a Columbia graduate, I had to throw that in, but the point is that's impacting what that resale cost is. Boards, trustees, government awareness is very interesting. They're certainly becoming more and more aware of this, and they just have questions. What about this? What about that? Go back to the 19-element spoke wheel, and you could see what the repercussions of that are. And finally, the demand for a comprehensive vendor neutrality, best practice, total cost of ownership versus risk. We're seeing that people want to understand that. They want to do a complete study. Many times, they've already made a move, started to make a move. They have individual silo people that are not necessarily coordinating those 19 elements. Again, those 19 elements are technically oriented. They're definitely, I always said, we're technically oriented people. I'm a paranoid, schizophrenic, conservative engineer. The bottom line is those 19 elements technically coming together and orchestrated well deliver an outstanding result for the customer, for the client, for the stockholder, because it's made to stand on its own legs. Total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. So having said that, and we made it with 1 minute over, sorry about that, because I'm very conscious of your time. It's 11:36 Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to open the floor. Feel free to send some questions down, and we will filter out the ones that we don't want to answer. But I'll turn this over so that we can start having a Q&A section to go through anything that might have a concern. Please feel free, by the way, to fill out the survey forms for this. And this is one of, we're going to continue to have these on a monthly type of basis, just to update you on what we're seeing in the industry. So, questions, comments? Sean.
So more of a comment. Says, it sounds like with a review of responses for cloud colocation contracts via your RFP process, BRUNS-PAK would have a unique view into new ideas for controlling, estimating cost, and what vendors are most financially stable and secure.
The answer is yes. And what we do is we have a grid matrix, by the way, when we put together these RFPs to actually protect the customer for moves, adds, and changes, for projected increased costs, and we bring a vendor neutrality. To us, we don't have a horse in that show. We want to do the best thing for the customer. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we do bring a different perspective to it, because if I'm a stockholder, I want to understand what's my best value. Next question.
Sure. What is the best way to mine all of my business critical data in a hybrid solution so that I can view the analysis of my business under one single pane of glass, if you would?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you know what the bottom line is that application mapping, and BRUNS-PAK doesn't do that, but that's a critical step in this, especially on some of these very large, robust type of clients. As to step number one is absolutely understanding all your applications and the mapping and how that interfaces with the network, and coming up with a comprehensive tier 1 through 4 list so you can understand the criticality of it is step one. That puts the initial step of, again, going to that element, applications under review, because that's very critical as an initial step of going forward. Other questions, Sean?
Regarding densities that you mentioned the iCloud server, and the question is, how are some of your clients handling these very high densities in their data centers? Very
good question about the densities. What are we seeing as far as densities on KW per cabinet and some of the high performance compute? We are absolutely seeing it hit the marketplace. Some of the legacy data centers, though, and that's no disrespect to them, they're not suited, and or some of the co-location or cloud facilities. because the densities of some of these we're talking about are extraordinary. And you really need to have a planned, flexible, modular, scalable MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing superstructure that can go and receive that. And it's kind of awesome when in fact the rack was configured to maybe go to 35, 40 kW. But by the way, I had initial deployment of 8 kW, but because I had my DCIM in and I knew that I could tie that into my variable frequency drives, that in fact, when I deployed to 10, 12, 14 kW, it spoke to the variable frequency drive. It increased the static pressure in the CFM. It gave me that 80-degree inlet temperature without doing anything. That's pretty awesome. But the answer is we are certainly seeing density start creeping up. And without the proper planning of it, we're seeing corresponding hot spots and issues of operation. Next question, Sean.
It appears that the overall data center solution or strategy has become more complex over the years. Can you share some other trends that you're seeing from your client community regarding that complex strategy?
Yeah, that's a very good question about the complex strategy. It's become more complex, and that's in essence the 19 elements that we talk about. It is very comprehensive if you want to look at the overall data center hybrid enterprise solution. It's complex in as much as the 19 elements in essence need to be orchestrated in our opinion. Total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. Put them in a technology blender process, which is what we do, and be able to kick that out into a report after 12 weeks, 14 weeks to say, hey, these are the recommendations and this is why. This is the total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk. In essence, it's a strategic roadmap for many years to come. And by the way, it's a living document that can continuously be updated as IT changes, as applications change, as criticality changes, as compliance regulatory issues. You can actually use that to manage that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis going back and forth. But to your point, the complexities of this, the days of the enterprise data center at X watts per square foot and everybody's happy is gone. And those 19 elements that you've seen, in doing this for 39 years, I've never seen such a transformation in the last 3 to 4 years ever, which I think is absolutely outstanding. And to get ahead of that and provide, in my opinion, the people that are technologically advanced that can harness and optimize the total cost of ownership versus best practice versus risk are the ones that are going to dominate in their different fields, whether it's education, whether it's finance, whether it's pharmaceutical, whether it's in drug manufacturing distribution, whether it's in corporate government and the like. We're currently working on and we're in an NDA, but with a, let's just say a government entity that has all the cybersecurity controls, all the data center best practices, all the high performance compute arrays. It's kind of awesome when you see what their overall initiative is and what their goals are. And we have about 2 minutes to go.
Yep, this is probably the last question.
Last question.
Slide 11, bullet point D.
Slide 11, this must be an engineer. Slide 11, bullet point D.
We talk about migration back. The question is, how important is it to ensure your cloud strategy includes the option to migrate back to your own data center or even to another cloud provider? Is it good to have a third party involved in the overall strategy to help facilitate the cloud migration or the migration back?
That's a very key question. The answer is yes. And that goes as well as enterprise. You want to have the flexibility to move. So that's a very key question, because there should always be a thought of what are your outs, what are your provisions in your contract. By the way, what are the cost impacts to that? When we talk about migration back, are you also talking about potentially propagating seed equipment wherever you're going because you cannot afford the physical move time? But that's a critical question to be able to address and have a plan going forward. The reality is this is a hybrid today. The mix of that is going to change over the years. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. And as applications change, as criticality of platforms change and the like, You need to be able to be flexible, move, and scalable, that you're not either paying penalties or paying surcharges, but you can move and go and have a scalable modular solution. That's why part of the agreements that we structure is a scalable, modular, optional type of contract with these third-party providers. So with this, it is 11:45 Eastern Standard Time. I want to be very respectful of everybody's time. Please fill out the surveys and rank it the best you've ever seen. Did you guys get that over in Texas? I'm only kidding. And England, but thank you for your time. But all seriousness, please fill out the survey, and we look forward to having you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.